Hello and welcome to Top of the Class with Grand Canyon University's College of Education. I'm Emily Pottinger.
And I'm Dr. Meredith Critchfield,
your hosts. So in this episode, we wanted to continue conversations that we started to have in our past episodes. We touched a little bit on the range of expectations that teachers tackle every day, day in, day out. And we know we need to practice that mindfulness, take care of ourselves physically, mentally, spiritually, to ensure that we are the very best teachers we can be for our students. But we heard a new term that really rang true for us: compassion fatigue. We were really excited to learn from our guest and expert today, Jamie Valderrama, on the topic of compassion fatigue and what we can do about it as teachers.
Absolutely. We're super grateful to learn more about this topic because this extended period of time that we've all been facing, it's been taxing on so many of us in so many ways. And I think especially taxing for teachers and educators who've been called to serve in even bigger and grander ways than they ever anticipated. Certainly not in their undergraduate program did they anticipate to be in the situation that they're in. And so we just really want to dive in and learn a little bit more. So I think first we should introduce our amazing guest today. Jamie Valderrama is a lecturer and undergraduate coordinator for the Integrative Health Initiative, and that's in the School of Social Work at Arizona State University. I'm an alum of ASU, as is Emily. Yes. And Jamie is so passionate about providing tools for responsive living through mindfulness and using her extensive background in education to successfully integrate the knowledge that's in her courses and also to reach out and help the community as well. So she really kind of gets her fingers in all the little baskets to help us all out. So we're so grateful for that. She also teaches undergraduate and graduate courses at ASU on stress management. And I would think it'd be safe to say, Emily, we could enjoy a few of those courses and learn a few things for ourselves in these really trying times. And in addition to teaching and training, Jamie is also an international and national keynote speaker. So we're so grateful that she's here today, taking the time out of her busy schedule and all the things we all know are going on in the world right now to be with us. So thank you so much, Jamie.
Oh, thank you for having me. As I mentioned earlier to you too, it's just such an honor. So anything I can do, I'm here.
Thank you. That in and of itself, we could just end the episode. It's beautiful.
Everybody's amazing who teaches.
So we really like to start our episodes out with just kind of getting that foundational background knowledge from you. Can you tell us a little bit more about compassion fatigue? What is it? And then maybe how that might specifically relate to the educators who will be listening and watching here today.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And no, when I'm talking about this with compassion fatigue, and I'll kind of touch in on vicarious trauma, which really they're one and the same, that this was well before we had a pandemic. Teaching historically is not an easy career to go into. And the folks going into it have huge hearts. You want to make a difference. You'll be part of something bigger than who you are. And then getting in a situation, unless you've been in a classroom, which we all have, nobody truly understands. It's very easy to step on the outside and look in, but unless you sat there with 35 plus students of varying levels of where they're at and varying backgrounds of trauma that they may be bringing into that classroom, you are a teacher, you are a social worker, you are mom, you are dad, you are everybody. And it is an incredibly powerful job, but an incredibly hard job. And that's really where this compassion fatigue comes in, is that any person who's in a career of social service, where you're helping others, you're going to be working with folks who are coming from different backgrounds and potentially where they've had trauma. And understand with trauma is a perspective. Trauma could be an emotional, could be physical, could be to the psyche. And what traumatizes one person may not traumatize another, which is really powerful. And that's what's so beautiful about humanity. We look at psychology, it's a soft science because we don't have definitive black and white as to why some people are more resilient than others. But what we know is this: you as an educator, if we talk about any social service, education's a huge one. You're working with an incredibly vulnerable population because they're minors. And you walk in and you don't know what they're coming from, whether they're coming from some type of abuse situation. And so you're dealing with this trauma on an ongoing basis as an educator. Compassion fatigue happens when through time, it's cumulative, that you, with this very empathetic, open heart, because that's why you're there, you start really, you're thinking about these kids, and you're learning more and more about their backgrounds, and you're going home, and it's really brings you down. Compassion fatigue really is kind of a wearing away psychologically and physiologically of your being. And if you cannot learn how to step back and create these boundaries and refuel and recharge, it leads actually into vicarious trauma, where not only now are you having this empathy, but you're now actually taking on the trauma. It's like a secondary trauma of what the kids in front of you have. Like, one of their parents died. So all of a sudden you have this huge heart, you understand how awful this is, you have all of this compassion that goes out for them. And then you start thinking, well, what if my partner died? And what if?
Yeah.
And so it moves the brain into this really hyper alert fight or flight system. And we know we're there when we're suffering from compassion fatigue because we're really reactive. We've gone into lizard brain, and our cognitive thinking is not as responsive. It's kind of been put on a back burner. We start isolating ourselves some more. We get burned out. We feel overwhelmed so incredibly easily. We're irritated. We become pessimists, right? You're like, why should I even try? There's nothing I can do. And so it's interesting. It mimics a lot of the same clinical symptoms we'd see with depression when we have it happening.
Wow.
This really is resounding with me, because when I started out, I developed compassion fatigue really, really heavily. So much so that I was absolutely dealing with my own life traumas, but then also feeling the traumas of my students as they would either, some situation would go on with bomb threats, or deaths of students, or deaths of students' parents, run-ins with the law of my students. And I started to really wear all of those. And I can absolutely see that vicarious trauma coming through. And I think when I started out in the field, I didn't have the coping mechanisms that I now have. So I think what you're saying here really, really speaks to so many of our undergraduates who are going to be graduating, or are recently graduated education students who are now entering this field, dealing with their own traumas, and then living vicariously through those traumas of our students. So that overview is so helpful for me.
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Yeah, you're right. You're totally right. None of us, when we first went into the classroom, you're taught all this foundational knowledge, but it's like the front lines. So you are in there, and then you're dealing with this. It is a completely different arena than what we look at from a book.
Absolutely. So we'd love to hear kind of guests' journeys into their passion. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how you came into this specific topic, this specific interest. Do you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I'm a teacher. That's what I was trained as. I taught high school for over 12 years. And it was funny. I reached that point in my career where I started thinking about, well, I've got to go on and I got to do some graduate work, right? So I can start moving over on the pay scale and actually making something. And I'm like, what do I want to do? And my undergrad's in biology, and I was always fascinated by the brain. And why do we behave the way we behave, and how does the physiology drive the psychology? And at the time, I was also teaching anatomy physiologies. I had a bunch of juniors and seniors who all potentially thought they might want to go into medical. So I thought, man, I need to, if I'm going to do this, I want to pursue something where I'm interested. And I think that's so important that we figure out where we find our interest. There's not to be passion, but there's got to be interest.
Yeah.
And I noticed that ASU at the time had an integrative health modalities certificate. And I thought, well, this is interesting, because a lot of these kiddos I have in the class think they want to become doctors or nurses or PAs or, physical therapists. And we know now that there's so much now integration with both Eastern and Western medicine. And I thought this would be really great to bring into my curriculum just to deepen it. So I started taking these courses. As I was taking these courses at ASU, I ended up being a teacher of the year for my high school, which I'll be telling you right now, that was my number one right there honor, because my peers had to actually nominate me. And we know, right? We know who doing what. But so I was teacher of the year for my high school, then for my district, and then I went on to be the top high school teacher in the state in 2010. Which was really cool. It was really terrifying, but it opened up this whole new arena for me to start really going around to all 3 state universities, to be going to classrooms from K-12 into businesses. And it was so, the universe, it just works really in an interesting way. That as I'm learning this, and I'm learning about mindfulness, and I'm learning about integrative health, I'm walking into classrooms and I'm seeing these really, really exceptional educators who are inherently mindful. They have no idea what the word means, but now I'm connecting all of the dots together. And I'm like, this is just fascinating. And I'm walking into businesses and I'm like, these really, really good leaders are inherently mindful. They've got groups of people who will do anything with them because they're so responsive. They take on that leadership role. And so this was, to me, I was like, okay, there's something, what's happening here? Because I won't lie. The first time I walked into a grad class, they're like, okay, we're going to breathe. And now you got to understand, my undergrad's biology. That's a hard science. I'm like, what do you mean we're going to breathe? Do you know how much money I'm paying for this class? I'm like, what? Are you crazy? And I was really, really resistant. I'm like, I breathe every day. But it took me getting into the science, right? Looking at it and going, okay, well, what does it mean? And I'm always a why person. And I always feel like students need to know that whenever I introduce a lesson. Why do we need to know this? Because you should have a reason why you're here, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so it was that correlation, though, between developing responsive behaviors. And now we know it's actually neuroplasticity, actually changing the way that the brain perceives stressful triggers in our environment, and being able to step back and be objective and responsive versus becoming reactive and emotionally charged. And so that, to me, I got into it. They turned it into a master's program. I'm like, I am all over this. Let me research with you because this is fascinating. And I would bring it back into my classroom because I'm still teaching, and we'd have mindful Mondays. And it was perfect with anatomy physiology because I could tie in what's happening in these organ systems when the body's in sympathetic versus parasympathetic. And we could get into like the nervous system and the neuroscience of it. And so for me, it's all about science though. I work with first responders. They're not going to just sit and breathe, these folks on a SWAT team, right? Unless I can explain why they're sitting and breathing, like what is going on with the brain. And so that's really, for me, that's what solidified it. And now, obviously, since then, the data's just exploded around the world and looking at the benefits of being able to deregulate the nervous system and increase that depth of your responsive behaviors. And I'm going to tell you right now, compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, these are huge triggers that put you into a really reactive state.
Sure.
So Jamie, you mentioned a little bit about that reptilian or lizard brain, as it's commonly called.
Yeah.
And I imagine some of our listeners are curious. They might want to know a little bit more. So tell us what that is.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Very simple explanation. If you were to hold your fist up and you were to look at where your wrist comes up to where the palm of your hand is, so that would be really your brainstem. And that's going to be the reptilian, right? Because it's the oldest portion of the brain, and its autonomic features like heart rate, respiration. Then when we go up into the mid, like where the palm is, if we opened it up a little bit, this is going to be our limbic system, our emotional regulation. And located in here is really interesting. It's something called the amygdala, and it's our gatekeeper to fear and anxiety. That's mammalian brain, second oldest. And then we have, we close our fist again and go along the top, we've got that neocortex, right? That's our critical thinking. It's our newest portion of the brain. It's cognitive thought. When the body, the nervous system's in something called parasympathetic, it's rest or digest, all three portions talk to one another, where everything's communicating. But when you're triggered and the brain is perceiving, now remember, this is a perception, it perceives that there's a potential threat, it will actually disengage that neocortex, critical thinking, and it will engage the limbic and the brainstem. And you go into this primitive loop, that's the lizard brain, between limbic, emotion, and autonomic features. And that's important because, if you truly are in a crisis, your brain doesn't want you to sit there and like, let me process this. Why are there zombies coming to eat me right now? Your brain's like, just get out of there, right? Go. We will process this later. And so your lizard brain kicks in, you get away from the threat, and then you come back to homeostasis, neocortex comes back online, and you process the experience. And so but you think when we talk about compassion fatigue, if you're chronically stressed and you're in compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, you're living in lizard brain. Your neocortex isn't there, it's on the back burner. You're not critically thinking and you're highly reactive. And that's why we'll do things and we look back and we're like, what was I thinking? Well, you really weren't thinking. So it's the ability to recognize that's where you're at and that you need to deregulate.
So when you say reactive, is that almost always an anger response, or can we go the other way and be apathetic or
fear, anxiety, anger. You know, I like to say there's two modes that we have a tendency to go into that we've trained our brain through a lifetime to do. When it gets quiet, and you're going to notice there's a lot of people who cannot handle quiet anymore. They have to have some kind of background noise because it gets really scary when it's quiet because your brain's like, oh, it's my turn, right? And all of a sudden, we've done this. We've trained these neural connections. We've trained it to either project, which is playing the what if game. What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't handle this class? What if I can't graduate? What if I can't pay this bill? What if this relationship doesn't work out? And when we play the what if game, clinically it leads to anxiety. And so if we're one of these people sit down, we have like reinforced over and over and over neural connections in the brain to default there. If we're not projecting, some of us are ruminating. We're going through the past and we keep reliving scenarios. It could be short-term, long-term. It could be a conversation you had with your boss or someone important over and over and over. And clinically that leads to depression. So, and some people, they're so good, they do both. They're like, oh, I can project and I can ruminate. Like I am depressed and I'm anxious, right? So it's the recognition that this is where you're at, that you can say, okay, I have spent a lifetime creating these really powerful neural connections to default in one of these two ways, but I can stop that. I can weaken that and I can come back to my present moment where I'm aware what's happening physiologically, because I'm telling you, physiology drives psychology. And I have a friend who's a psychiatrist. He said, Jamie, if people would just stop and listen to their bodies, they'd never need another self-help book. So it's a precursor as to where you're about to go.
Wow. That I'm just like, it's soaking all of that in. That's really interesting. And I think our students, our current teachers, that's like Meredith was saying, that's all going to resonate with them. So there's a topic, this is going to be kind of a multi-part question. A topic that's still kind of taboo in the teaching profession. And sometimes, you know, we get the hush, don't talk about it. Even after all these years, is teacher burnout. And what's so unique about teaching specifically that makes burnout so real? That's a real possibility, is burnout for teachers.
Oh yeah, I'm telling you, my first year of teaching, this is no lie. I came home every night. I had a bottle of wine next to me, and I had an ongoing application to PA school. I am not lying. It was like that was my first year, and then every subsequent year, I just loved it more and more. But it is real. And the thing to remember with burnout is that, and you don't want to really tie that to compassion fatigue, because burnout is more the job itself. It's feeling overwhelmed. It's having low power and not feeling like you have a voice. There's really that job satisfaction is really negative. Why is it taboo? I mean, you know, the thing is, it's because we don't want to imagine that our teachers who are in front of our kids, right, could potentially ever experience anything like this. And I think it really ties in too, if you just kind of look at how we've been with mental illness in this country alone. It's perceived as a weakness. It's not perceived as something that a professional, educated person should ever experience, you know? And I think the key right there to dismantling that is understanding that we all experience that, right? We all experience, I mean, especially now, generalized anxiety and burnout is very real. And in teaching, are you kidding me? I mean, unless you've been in that classroom, like we said, 35 different levels of learners, maybe not having the most supportive administrative staff that maybe you need, or having people who are modeling and helping you, you know, the expectations from the parents, the expectations from your administrators, from your district. And so it's very overwhelming. So burnout is a very real thing.
Yeah. So if I'm a teacher, what are some signs that maybe I can keep an eye out for that might trigger, oh, I might be kind of on the cusp of teacher burnout here?
You know, and I love that you said it that way, because it's so important that we're mindful. And if we could just pay attention to the signals again, we don't ever reach that point of falling off the cliff, because all of a sudden we're just at this one day, we're like, I'm just miserable. And it's like, it didn't just happen. Trust me, there's this whole lead up into that, right? It's recognizing that when you're walking away, you know, is your heart feel full or does it feel empty, right? It's like, because I can tell you right now, I used to say this all the time, if they would just shut my door and never talk to me, just let me be with these kids, that would be my joy, right? But that's not necessarily what happens, right? But feeling like you're in a system that doesn't serve you, that's broken, that it doesn't matter what you do. A lot of times I'll see this with teachers, this pessimism. Well, why should I even try? Because they're just going to say no, or they're just going to change this, or it's going to be a flavor of the month. There'll just be a new training. And when you find yourself doing that, you really need to step back and you say, okay, wait, what's going on here? Because the cool thing about burnout, honestly, is that you can change burnout, right? You can change your job, you can change your situation. And so it's important to recognize, are you in burnout, or are you really emotionally just becoming this cavern? But burnout can be, you're going to feel a lot of the same. Actually, it's really crazy. You're going to feel a lot of the same symptoms, or a lot of things you'll exhibit are the same when you start having compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. But it's just paying attention and being able to step back and say, okay, is this because I'm dealing with these emotionally charged students, or is this because my job,
Okay.
That's interesting to think about. So if we have teacher burnout, you mentioned you could leave. Are there any other ways that we can address the teacher burnout other than just leaving the position?
Yeah, we don't want to just have to leave.
Right. What else can we do though? Because I imagine there are some listeners thinking, I felt this, or I'm feeling this, but I do love my students. So what does that look like? How do we fix that?
So I think what you need to do is, the first thing is, remember, you're not an island. And I think a lot of times we think that we're alone in all of this. You are not alone in how you're feeling. It's making sure that you've developed among your peers a really strong, a social support group. And I'm going to say that's one of the biggest things I've missed since I moved on to the university, is that, I had this group in my department that we would have lunch together and we'd collaborate and we talk, and there are those people that when you have a really bad day or something going on, you can just gripe, and it's not going to go anywhere, right? so I mean, I think it's having a social support system. And then it's also really recognizing what's going on with the culture of your campus. It's not that can't be changed. And so if you recognize, it's being an advocate and being proactive and making that appointment with your administrator and sharing how you feel. Because I'm going to tell you, most people who are there, they're there because they're doing the very best with the tools that they have too. But they have a very different perspective of how they're looking at this campus versus how you're looking at this campus. And so just knowing that it's not that, we just want you to be miserable, but that it's just they have maybe a little different way that they're looking at it, and meeting in the middle. But it's not isolating, because I think what happens is we start self-isolating, thinking it's just us, and we push ourselves further and further back, when communication really is the key. It is. You've got to have that social support system. You've got to be able to communicate. And I'm going to say this above all, you need to be positive. It is really, really easy to jump the negativity train, but it is a lot harder to walk in and say, well, what's good? And I'm gonna tell you, that's what I start every class with. I started in high school. I started at my undergrad, my grad, and even my meetings. What's good? Because we have an opportunity to change the way that the brain scours the world. It's just a brain game.
Oh, I love that. And I got to give a shout out to Emily here, because she is part of my social support system at GCU. And we are so lucky at GCU to have that kind of network where, Emily and I were in each other's weddings, and we've helped raise our little kiddos together. And several of us have been in each other's weddings, and we send our kids to the same school. We share babysitters. And so I think that is something that's definitely kept so many of us at GCU for so long, amongst many other things. But having that social network, I think, is huge. And I impress that upon our early career teachers who are listening. So that is an incredible tip that I don't think I personally used enough when I first got into the classroom. I did want to be on my island. I love English language arts, and I wanted to close the door and talk Hamlet. But it really had its repercussions on me. And so I'm so grateful that you shared that whole bit with us. That was fantastic.
Well, and a lot of us will feel too, because I know when you're a first year brand new teacher, you guys, you learn. That's when you really learn the material. I mean, there were times I was 3 seconds, if that, ahead of these kids. And so, reaching out feels like it's an inadequacy, like, I'm not capable. I don't want people to know, like, what if they find out that I really don't know biology, right? and so, but it's understanding that we're all there, and that, that's why that wonderful teacher who's been there 7, 10, 15 years, that it's so much more seamless for them. They've had all this time to really develop their material, and you get there and they know where you're at, and that's totally okay to be where you're at, So it's just don't be insecure about who you are.
Well, and our next question, you kind of touched on it actually already. We were talking about the connection between compassion fatigue and teacher burnout, and I love that you mentioned don't mistake one for the other. They're two separate things.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to go any more into that, but they do share similar traits.
Completely, but they are different, because the thing is, you can have compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, and you can be like, well, I just hate this school. It's not the school, right? It's that you haven't developed the self-care techniques to refill yourself, because you just drained the battery and you're not recharging the battery. And it doesn't matter where you go.
Yeah.
The same thing's going to happen unless you can figure out, because that's just who you are. That's your nature. You're going into a career of social service. I always tell my students, because I'm in social works in the College of Public Service Community Solutions, all the students I work with, I'm like, you're going into the fields you're going into because you want to make a change. And you don't fight darkness with darkness, right? You got to figure out how you can be that light. Doesn't mean that you don't process that darkness when it hits you, but it doesn't mean you carry it over either. So you need to figure out, what is happening. And there's this really great story that I learned. Somebody told me early in my teaching career, and it made a big impact. Somebody was complaining, and they said, let me tell you a story. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I want to hear this. We're at lunch. And they said there are these two gentlemen who get on a train. They're moving to a new town. And so they both get on this train. They go to this new town. The first guy gets off, and there's another person sitting on a bench in the new town. And the first gentleman says, hey, I'm new to this town. What's this town like? And he's like, well, what was your old town like? It was amazing. They were positive, supportive. I loved it. I'm just here because there's another job opportunity. And the guy says, hey, you're going to find out that this town is just like that. And the other guy gets off, and he goes, hey, I'm new to this town. What's this town like? He goes, what was your old town like? It was horrible. They were negative. There was no support. Nobody would help you. And the guy just looked at him and he goes, well, you're going to discover this town is just like that also. And that's kind of it, right? It's our perspective.
Yeah.
And it's us recognizing, is this personal? Is this something that we need to really learn to pay attention to? Or is this really something that is outside of our control?
Sure. Great.
And you mentioned this idea of self-care, which is sort of a topic that's related to compassion fatigue and teacher burnout. But self-care seems almost unattainable for a lot of teachers, because we're like, we are stacked from 6 to 6, and how do we possibly put in time for a manicure, or possibly add in a yoga class, or how do we possibly do these things? The time for prayer. So what would you say to that? And then are you able to share some of your favorite self-care methods or things that we could do that are easy for us as teachers?
Right. I'm going to tell you, it doesn't take a lot. It really doesn't. When we look at data for meditation, 10 minutes a day, that's it. In 3 weeks, we actually see the neocortex become thicker, meaning you become more focused and responsive, and we see the amygdala shrink. 10 minutes. Everybody's got 10 minutes, really? Seriously, right? You could sit there before class, you could sit there at lunch, and you just take and you do some breathing exercises. Maybe you don't, if you like meditation, there's a bunch of apps out there, and especially Calm, Headspace, they actually offer free subscriptions to teachers. There's not a reason just to say, I'm gonna do 5 minutes, I'm gonna do 2-minute breathing exercise. I'm gonna tell you, and it's being really honest and modeling for students, because I get it. I taught an 8-hour. I was there at 6:30. I did overload. And then I would run to ASU and teach as a faculty associate 3 days a week right after. My students would know, there are times I would say, I'm like, okay, we're going to do some breathing. And I would do this before, by the way, with assessments, because a lot of them had test anxiety. They have test anxiety, they could go into fight or flight. So we do some simple breathing exercises to deregulate, calm their brain down, but it would give me an opportunity too. And there are times they'd be like, oh, they'd see me and they're like, oh, Mrs. V needs to breathe right now. And I'm like, yes, I do need to breathe. And so it's making it organic. So I would just stop and I would have these different breathing exercises myself throughout the day, at the beginning, in the middle, at the end. It's going for a walk. You don't have to join the gym and say, well, I can't afford yoga, or I can't make that class. Then don't. The thing is, it's really amazing. Go for a walk outside. Whenever you utilize your senses, it's a great brain trick, because it forces the brain to be present, because you're gathering data to make sure that you're safe. So if you purposely say, what do I see? what do I hear? How does it feel as I'm walking? What do I smell? The brain is present. And the whole goal is we want to train the brain to be present more, because then we tend to be more responsive, we're happier, and we're more productive. So I would say find things that you enjoy. Reading a chapter at night, I still do. And we are all so busy, but I get my favorite trashy novel and I lay there and I'll read like just, 2 chapters. And it's not a lot, but it's that maybe 15, 20 minutes that just kind of refocuses me. So that's really the goal. It's just to kind of come back to your center and not get so far away from your center that you get lost. So it doesn't have to be a lot. I meditate every morning. I only do it for 15 minutes. The first thing I do, I get up early, I have my coffee, I meditate. It sets the foundation for how I want to move forward for the rest of my day, how I want to treat people, how I want to treat myself. I make time for exercise, the body and the brain. You keep the both of them. I do meditation for the brain. I get out for a walk, even if it's in the evening with the dog and my husband. And now, hey, that's like a double whammy, right? Like now I'm working on relationships and I'm walking. So I do something with them like that. But it doesn't have to be a lot. It could be something very simple, but it's just for you. And you can't think that it's selfish. And I think that's a lot of times we think, well, I don't have time. You don't have time not to do it, because we give what we fill ourselves with. And if we fill ourselves with compassion and love, and we recognize and that respect that we need this time, that's what we give. But if we fill ourselves up with anxiety and fear and frustration, that's what we give. And ultimately, as educators, we're the ultimate role models, right? They've got to, when I got Teacher of the Year, they went and interviewed all my kids. Do you think one student's like, oh, I learned so much about the integumentary system, or she changed my life with biology? Not one. They're like, she taught me how to be a better person leaving than I came in. When I would get in a really sticky situation, I think, what would Mrs. V say? And so it was all about relationships. It was about being calm and really just facing life more responsibly than reactively.
Oh, I love that. Emily, I'm going to toss it to you. Do you have any self-care tips that you've sort of developed over the years as a teacher that you're like, our audience has just got to know it. This works.
I mean, I think I mirror what's been discussed so far. And it, as you were talking, Jamie, about going for a walk, it made me think about, I have a 2-year-old, and we do kind of a little morning walk before it gets too hot out right now in Phoenix. And having a toddler, even though it is a wild situation and sometimes adds a lot of stress to the plate, it does really force me as an adult who's busy juggling lots of different things to reconnect with elements that I think sometimes you ignore or forget or just skip over. So when we go on those little walks, I find myself, he's noticing things, so I'm pointing things out to him, and we're having that, dialogue, and it's helping me start my day, reconnect without even realizing that I've done it. And then we both come back from the walk feeling kind of refreshed at the start of the day. So that triggered that I was actually doing that when you were mentioning.
And you didn't even realize it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are good. I love those. I go for 7 days a week at 5 a.m. I go for a 45-minute walk. Like clockwork. I don't care what else is going on. I am going for that walk, and it evolved during the pandemic. And that's actually what I've heard several of my teacher colleagues do as well, that this morning walk has evolved during the pandemic. It was their way to kind of get out of the house and to have that moment to breathe. And I thought, what an interesting little study that would be, to see like how many teachers are taking on walking to kind of get out and to be present and to be with their senses. I can't even tell you how many teachers I've heard say that. So I was like, that's so fascinating to me.
You know what you should do too, which is really cool, is that, integrate it into your curriculum. That's all mindfulness is. It's purposely paying attention. It's training ourselves to be here and now, not playing the what if game, not, projecting or ruminating. And so integrate it into your curriculum. I know for science, it was incredibly easy. It could be part of the scientific method. You go out and you sit, what do you see? And purposely be staying right there. And it can be all different levels, having kids sit still. How does your body feel? What's the color of anger? What is, there's just so many things you can do that you can just really bring it in. But it's a great way to step back and teach them to be reflective, but also give you that moment to practice it and to model it and to explain why it's important.
So
Yeah.
true. My sweet daughter, she's 3, and she's been she'll say her prayers and she'll bow her head and she'll just say what she's grateful for. Just rattles off one after the next. I'm grateful
Mhm.
for my mommy, my daddy, my school, my teacher, my friends, and she'll name her certain friends like Emily's son. I'm thankful for Elliot. But it's beautiful because then I do see that carry throughout the day, because she'll have these moments where things are quiet. She'll say, I'm just so thankful for you. I am so thankful. And how wonderful that is to just just take those moments of gratitude. Again, like we've said, it doesn't have to be a lot of time. It just has to be some time, but
Yeah.
then it sort of infiltrates throughout the day. It's not just a moment in time. It shows up again and again when you practice those things. So yeah, those are wonderful tips.
Absolutely. So, taking a little twist on the conversation, I read this article on the Teaching Tolerance website, and it was the toolkit for I thought about quitting today. And I and I think, we've probably all been there when we just had a day and we're like, I can't do it. I can't do it anymore. But one of the things that was mentioned in this little article, it referenced compassion satisfaction. And I thought that was really interesting, as we're talking about compassion fatigue, looking at it in a different way, compassion satisfaction. And I think so many of us go into teaching because we truly want to help others. Like you said, we want to make that difference, whatever that difference is. So it mentioned kind of assessing the quality of life. So what do you think? I know you kind of started to touch on that. What do you think about the concept of compassion, satisfaction, and kind of quality of life in general?
Well, that's why you're doing what you're doing, right? I mean, seriously, if we look at what really brings a happy person, we look at positive psychology, it's that we have pleasure in our life, that we have engagement, but that we have meaning.
Yeah.
And there is not a career that you will have more meaning than it is in education.
Yeah.
It is a career where you can do great good or you can do great damage. I like to say that our classrooms are we decorate them, right? They become a climate, but our mood is the daily weather. And so we have this opportunity to positively or negatively affect. Now, compassion, satisfaction, I know you've all been there. You walked out of class after an exceptional lesson or somebody got it, that aha went off and your heart is full. And you're just like, there's not, or they write you a note. I don't know about anybody else. I used to have my entire wall was of my, and that's when I had those really hard days, I'd turn and look, I'm like, okay, why am I doing this? Oh, we love you, Mrs. V. We da 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 da. And I would read these notes, and that is invaluable. And I gotta tell you, I had one student who took science with me for 3 years. I did student council. She was in student council. She went on to teach. And when she was going through ASU, and she's going through every month, she'd come in and she would just sit and I'd have her grade, and I had a candy drawer, of course, and she would just visit with me. And she did this for 5 years. She went through her education. And I asked her at the end when she's getting ready to graduate, I said, why have you been here every month? And you just helped me out. I said, the candy. And she goes, because Mrs. V, you remind me of the teacher I need to be. And I just was like, okay, now tell me, I don't care. That's it. I don't need anything else. Like that's a life. I mean, that's why we do it. So there's absolutely, this is why we're here. But the key is to really pay attention, because that can slide in to compassion fatigue so easily if we're not taking care of ourselves. The greatest gift you can give yourself is to take care of you and model that to these kids, because then they're going to start creating that foundation.
Yeah. It's so funny you mentioned the little notes. I taught first grade, so it took me a lot longer to receive some of those notes and to see where my students ended up. But now many of them have graduated high school and are going into college. And I actually ran into, just a couple weeks ago, went in to get my fall scented candle from Bath and Body Works, obviously. And the greeter at the door, she said, Miss Perquis, my maiden name. And I was like, yes. and obviously I taught her in first grade, so she looked very different. And she said, my cousin and I had you in first grade. I was like, oh my, and I'm quite pregnant right now. So I was not pregnant then. And so it was just all of these, like the stars aligned. And she said, yes, of course we remember you. You are our favorite teacher. And it was just one of those moments that gives you the warm and fuzzies, even though it was I mean, goodness, it was probably at least a decade ago, if not more, that she had me as a teacher, and I'm just now receiving, my note of gratitude.
It's invaluable. The what you will get, the positives from this career, it's invaluable. There's just nothing that you can compare it to. You really can't.
Absolutely. You've had so many gems and so many pearls of wisdom. And I just wish I were taking notes the whole time so I could just think about it some more, not ruminate too much, but think about it.
Ruminate, as long as it doesn't take control of you. There's nothing wrong with doing that. We let it take control of us, right?
But we wonder if you just have one last little pearl for us that we can kind of take away, one last tip or reminder for us as educators.
Absolutely. I'm going to say it, and I say it all the time to my students. I'm going to say it again, and you've already heard it. You can't give what you don't have. That's it. You have got to fill yourself with what you want to give to this world, and it's going to be personally and professionally. And so you've got to make sure that you are taking care of you. And that's what, then when you do that, it is amazing that you fill yourself with non-judgment. You're not going to judge anyone around you, that you fill yourself with compassion, because now you're going to be compassionate. You have got to make sure you practice that. And one of the things, and I think you guys have it, is just that website. We did create a website through ASU. We worked with another foundation outside, and it's called survivalguideforteachers.com, and it's therapists are on there. It just gives you all these different little tidbits from counselors, and how resiliency and compassion fatigue, and how do you build relationships in classrooms. And so it's free. It's like,
Awesome.
Look at it. There might be some tidbits there that could be beneficial.
Awesome. Well, I don't think we could end on a better note. That's all we have for you today. So thank you so much, Jamie. We could chat for hours. But we want to thank you. We want to thank Grand Canyon University's Worship Arts Studio, because they make us sound great in the development of Top of the Class.
Yes. And again, thank you so much, Jamie. It was
Absolutely.
I just feel like I learned so much in the time that we've been together. And I know everyone listening and watching will as well. So
thank you.
Absolutely. And we would love for all of y'all listening and watching to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It just kind of helps other educators find us, especially in iTunes. That's where a lot of folks find us. And so if you would go in there, rate, subscribe. And if anybody has podcast topics, we want to know that too. So we are on Twitter at GCU_TOTC. The TOTC stands for Top of the Class. And I'd say until next time, Go Lopes!